Alright, hello, and today I'm starting a new devlog series for my new game Churner, where I go over the full development and the many struggles of making a game using Scratch's engine, as well as the pros. By the time I start making this video, Churner will be in its beta stage, however, I'll be going back to an older version to catch you up on the game. First off, I must add that Churner was originally made on one sprite, and it still is. That means the game was made with a lot of limitations on the already existing limits of Scratch. All art, code, and music is made by me because I don't like using public assets. To understand the old version of Churner, you have to understand a little bit of the story. I would recommend playing the game on Scratch, but this is a devlog, so I'll tell you here. If you want to skip the whole backstory, I'll put a timestamp on screen so you can skip to the actual development process. Churner takes place in a wacky world called the Bloxam, and Churner is actually the name of the land that lies between two kingdoms, ruled by the Fire King, Hypermag, and the Ice King, Black Ice. The kingdom started a war because the Ice King wanted to use an extremely unstable weapon called the Void. The Fire King wasn't worried until he realized the Void could wipe everything, so he waged war against the Ice Kingdom. After a long battle, the Fire Kingdom won and tried to take over Churner but accidentally unleashed an ancient darkness that possessed the Fire King and caused him to go mad. I won't go over how Churner became what it is now, but the Fire King going mad did cause everything. Now since we're done with the story, I can tell you about the alpha stage of Churner. Churner is an RPG game where you wander a world via point and click. You can encounter many NPCs and fight them using a variety of weapons. We'll begin with a blank Scratch canvas. The first thing I did was draw the window of the game without a single idea of what I wanted other than the theme, fire. The reason for the window was because I was making a small collection of one-sprite games in a single Scratch project called Multi-Sprite. After making the window, I wanted to come up with a name for it, and I came up with Churner. On the window, I had a bit of empty space, so I mapped out the UI for the game and made the very first room. After that, I realized I didn't think of a good combat system, and I didn't even have a story at the time, so I did what I always do, and just started adding random stuff. I drew the next room and added an item, the dagger-shaped rock, and made another room and added a guy. The guy's name was Fergie, and he was supposed to be a fire guard but ended up being some dumb character who wanted to hurt the player with insults. From there, the game looked pretty janky because there was static, and the game looked very bland, so I added water and made some more rooms. But then I realized I added too many stat bars, and I forgot what they were supposed to do. So, again, I did what I always do and added even more random stuff. Skipping to when I had to face combat, like 4 rooms from the start, I came into a big dead end, because there was no combat at all, so I was wondering, how do you add combat to a point-and-click game while trying to be unique? I decided the very best and most efficient combat would be clicking squares. And that's what started the combat system for Churner. At first, the combat was simple, but poorly executed, and I mean poorly executed, because squares would spawn anywhere on the screen, and sometimes black squares would spawn. Black squares are what you aren't supposed to touch. So you would get hit by those squares because the squares were actually overlapping with each other. I didn't bother to fix it yet because it wasn't that big of a deal and Churner was a very simple game. After making the combat and adding a way to be passive, I started making the Ashlands. That's when the game started becoming much more serious for me. I mapped out the lore for the Ashlands and I tried adding newer combat squares to the game, the black squares I talked about earlier. When making most of the Ashlands, I started running out of ideas at around room 6. So I sketched out a new enemy, and he looked like more of a boss, so I moved him to the end. The enemy was the Fire Mech, and I started running into a new problem with the game, which is the player just walking through rooms. You shouldn't be allowed to just walk through rooms in a story-based game and make it to the end without doing anything. So I added a new character called Non-Beat Guy, which is Beat Guy's brother, and he sells climbing gear which you need to make it out the Ashlands. By then, I also started telling myself something I think most developers should hear. Don't focus on the speedrunners speedrunning your game, because then you're going to feel like you have no content. After telling myself this, I went back and added more to the already existing rooms so they'd have more content. With that came the Ash Cluster, Pale Nurse, and some more Ashmen. I came to realize how janky my game actually was when I tried to go back and add a whole bunch of polish. I should say, for bigger games or projects, focus on polish. For Churner, the polish was really bad, and because of that, the game was taking a long time to update. Now, between version 0.4 and 0.7, there was a lot of quality of life changes. And because of that, Churner feels much more refined in terms of gameplay and looks. Now, since this is supposed to be a devlog, I'm going to give a list of problems I ran into and quickly explain how I solved them. Now, I must say I am not working alone. I am getting input from an actual programmer who knows how to script in various programming languages, excluding Scratch. We'll call him Bones. To fix the issue of combat squares overlapping, Bones suggested I rework the combat system and use a grid for the squares to spawn on. And since I'm so lazy, it took way longer to implement because I didn't follow good practices, which I didn't even know mattered, such as don't abbreviate variables. var1, IIH, PSTM, it makes it harder for everyone to read, because for those variables, they make sense to me. var1 being a multi-purpose variable, I'll get into that in a moment, and IIH being item in hand, to check if something's in your hand. It seems pretty simple to me, but to you, when I said that, you probably didn't even understand what I was talking about. And that brings me to my next point. Don't make multi-purpose variables. And I say this because I broke this rule after I was advised not to several times, and it costed me 2 hours of debugging. And it turns out Bones was right all along. So if you're new, follow good practices, because it will save you lots, and I mean lots of time. Churner isn't exactly a looker when it comes to its retro style. That's because I didn't put a whole bunch of time into the initial art, which is why I have to go back and polish it. But polish isn't just about quality of life and looks, it's also about gameplay and easy to remember audio feedback. A good example is when squares spawn. You hear a clicking sound, and when you click it, you hear another sound. That's because in order for your game to feel better, it has to sound better too. Remember those black squares I told you about? Well, I added some polish to it by simply preventing the squares from spawning near other squares. While this may seem small, it's actually a big change in gameplay, because when you go from green square to red square, there may be a black square blocking your fastest path to stop you from making just a straight line, which increases the difficulty and annoyance. However, to stop the difficulty from being unfair, black squares can't spawn near other squares, making the game significantly more bearable. To wrap up this mini section, I need to put emphasis on audio cues. When you click a red square, there's a chance for it to become a mana cube, which gives +1 mana. I want the player to associate the sound of mana with a very specific cue. Now, when you hear this cue, you think mana, which is important because it adds more life and allows you to connect with the game better. I added a character called the Rainbow, and he would act as the guide for Churner. So, I had Bones play the early stage of Churner, and he pointed out some of the bars were unclear because of the lack of labeling and explanation, which had encouraged me to put Rainbow in the very second room. A good thing to understand when you make a game is that you can easily see that your game is extremely straightforward, but that's not always the case for other players. Different people think different things, so that's why I made the guide significantly more noticeable. So, to understand this problem, I need to explain what happened. Since Churner wasn't originally a game for multi-sprite, Churner was in a small window where you played the game. But since Churner was becoming its own thing and evolving, I needed to scale up the game. It took me about 3 minutes to scale up the entire thing. However, there was a massive problem I assume most scratchers don't know how to solve. And that problem is how hitboxes work when you scale up a game. I'm going to try and explain Bones' interpretation of how this issue goes. Basically, when you scale up a sprite that contains elements you can interact with, like a button, the newly sized up element listens to its original size. So, to fix this, you must call the element's functionality, listening to the button, where the size is being scaled. So that was me trying to explain Bones' interpretation. But, to put it in a way people like me understand, You gotta add the button where the size changes or it'll listen to its old size. I nerfed the mana fountain because it made the nurse useless and it was absolutely busted. I made it so Ram and the nurse now fight back because originally it was just a short piece of dialogue and then they died. I made the window for Churner no longer draggable after scaling up the game because it was pointless to drag it around. I added a shop UI and a crafting UI because talking to the characters to figure out how to craft something made the game feel chopped. I fixed layering issues with the game in general because there were a crap ton. I made it so that you could skip through the dialogue because waiting for the text to go by was extremely boring. I reworked the gold system and changed how gold is displayed because it used to look like a health bar except yellow, and you'd have to count your gold and gold would be scarce. I added fire and decay squares, then shortly after I slowed down the speed of the effects and added visual feedback. I fixed not being able to attack Beat Guy because you didn't beat him up in the village. Lastly, I added a way to trash items and a key slot. Now since I've gone through most of the features from old Churner that were fixed in the newer versions, I get to post typical vlogs about the game's progress, and hopefully you check them out. But for now, I'll let this be the end of the video with a small conclusion for starting developers like myself. Follow good practices, take advice from others, make a proper guide. And lastly, have fun making your projects or whatever you're working on, because if it's not fun, what's the point?